They say a mother never forgets the sound of her child's cry. Clara Whitmore wished she could. For 5 years, those phantom cries had haunted her empty house, echoing through rooms that should have been filled with laughter. 3 cradles she'd carved with her own hands. 3 graves she'd dug in ground too frozen for proper burials. 3 reasons why she lived alone on the edge of Montana territory, where the wind never stopped and visitors never came. Until tonight. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, the kind of storm that swallowed homesteads whole and left nothing but memories come spring. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the world disappear into white nothingness. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but her hands still gripped the cup like an anchor. That's when she heard it, not the wind, not the groaning of her cabin under the weight of snow. Something else, something impossible, a baby crying. Clara's blood turned to ice. She knew that sound. It was burned into her soul, a wound that never healed. But this was different. This was real. This was coming from outside. Without thinking, she grabbed her heaviest coat and pushed into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving ice into her face. But she pressed forward, following the sound, following what might be her last chance at redemption. What she found half buried in the snow would test everything she believed about mercy, family, and the price of doing what's right. Because sometimes saving a life means risking your own, and sometimes a stranger's child becomes the key to healing a mother's broken heart. But Clara didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that somewhere in this deadly storm, a baby was crying, and this time, she wasn't going to let it stop. Clara Whitmore had been hearing phantom cries for 5 years. Every mother who'd lost a child knew the torture. Your mind playing tricks, making you hear what your heart desperately wanted to be real. She'd learned to ignore them, to push through the false hope that maybe somehow one of her babies had survived. But this cry was different. This cry came with the wind. The storm had been battering her cabin for 3 days straight, the worst blizzard Montana territory had seen in a decade. Snow piled against her walls like white graves, and the temperature had dropped so low that her breath crystallized the moment it left her lips. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the world vanish into endless white. Her coffee cup trembled in her hands, not from the cold, but from the sound cutting through the wind's howl. A baby, crying, close. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "Not again. You're hearing things, Clara. There's no baby out there." But even as she spoke, she was already moving, driven by an instinct stronger than logic. Her hands found her heaviest coat, her thickest boots, her woolen scarf that had belonged to her late husband. The crying grew louder, more urgent, cutting through the storm like a knife through silk. She threw open the door and the blizzard nearly knocked her backward. Wind like frozen daggers tore at her clothes, and snow drove horizontally across the landscape, turning her farm into an alien world of drifts and shadows. The temperature had to be 20 below, maybe worse. No living thing could survive out here, especially not a baby. But the crying continued. Clara pushed forward, each step a battle against the wind. Her boots sank deep into snow that reached past her knees, and ice crystals formed on her eyelashes, making it hard to see. But she followed the sound, letting it guide her into the storm. "Hello," she called, her voice instantly swallowed by the wind. "Is someone there?" The crying came again, weaker now, barely audible above the storm's fury. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she struggled toward the sound, her breath coming in sharp puffs that froze before they could dissipate. 20 yards from her cabin, near the old paddock fence that marked the edge of her property, she saw it. A dark shape in the snow, small and still, wrapped in what looked like faded red cloth. For a moment, Clara thought it was just debris blown by the storm, a bundle of rags maybe, or a dead animal. But then the shape moved, just slightly, and the crying came again. Weak, desperate, human. Clara fell to her knees beside the bundle, her hands shaking as she brushed away the snow. What she found made her gasp. A baby, maybe 8 months old, skin pale as winter moonlight, lips tinged blue with cold. The child was wrapped in a red woolen shawl that was soaked through and frozen stiff. Underneath, crude fur garments provided some protection, but not enough, not nearly enough. The baby's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes almost black, set in a face that told Clara immediately what she was looking at. Native American features. Comanche most likely, based on the intricate beadwork she could see on the tiny moccasins. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Clara breathed, gathering the child against her chest. The baby was so cold, so still, that for a terrifying moment she thought she was too late. But then those dark eyes focused on her face, and tiny fingers grasped weakly at her coat. Alive. The baby was alive. Clara struggled to her feet, cradling the child against her body, trying to share what warmth she had. The wind seemed to sense her urgency, driving snow into her face with renewed fury, as if the storm itself was trying to stop her from saving this life. She stumbled back toward her cabin, every step a fight against the wind and the snow and the fear that she might be too late. The baby had stopped crying now, which terrified her more than the sound had. Silence could mean sleep, but it could also mean death. "Stay with me," she whispered against the child's frozen hair. "Don't you dare give up now. Not when I just found you." The cabin seemed impossibly far away, though she'd only traveled 20 yards. The storm disoriented everything, turning familiar landmarks into white phantoms. But finally, blessedly, she saw the warm yellow glow of her windows cutting through the darkness. She burst through the door and slammed it behind her, shutting out the storm's fury. The sudden silence was deafening. Clara stood there for a moment, snow melting off her clothes in puddles, the baby still clutched against her chest. Only then did she realize what she'd done, what she'd brought into her home. The child in her arms wasn't just any baby. The clothing, the beadwork, the facial features. This was a Comanche child. In Montana territory, where tensions between white settlers and native tribes ran higher than the mountain peaks, harboring a Comanche baby was more than dangerous. It was potentially deadly. But as Clara looked down at the tiny face, at the dark eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond their months, she felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in 5 years. Not just maternal instinct, though that was certainly part of it. Something deeper. Something that whispered this child was meant to find her, meant to be saved by her hands and no others. The baby's lips moved, making the faintest sound, not a cry this time, but something softer, almost like a sigh of relief. Clara carried the child to the fire and began the careful work of saving a life. She had no idea that in doing so, she was about to set in motion events that would change not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone in the valley. Because the baby she'd found in the snow wasn't just any Comanche child, and the people looking for him wouldn't stop until they found him. The question was, when they came to her door, would they come in peace, or would they come ready for war? Clara peeled away the frozen outer garments with hands that shook from more than cold. The baby's skin was pale, almost translucent, with a blue tinge that spoke of dangerous hypothermia. But the child was breathing, chest rising and falling in shallow but steady rhythms. "That's it," she murmured, wrapping the baby in warm blankets from her own bed. "Keep fighting. You're safe now." But even as she spoke the words, Clara wondered if they were true. Because in this territory, with tensions between settlers and tribes reaching a breaking point, there was no such thing as safe, especially not for a white woman harboring a Comanche child. The baby's eyes fluttered open again, and for a moment, Clara could have sworn those dark depths held an intelligence that shouldn't have existed in someone so young. As if this child understood exactly who had saved him and why. As if he'd been waiting for her all along. Outside, the storm continued to rage, burying the valley deeper in snow and ice. But inside Clara's cabin, beside the warm glow of the fire, two souls who had both been lost in different ways began the slow process of finding each other. Clara had no way of knowing that 20 miles away, a Comanche war party was following tracks that the storm hadn't quite erased. Tracks that led directly to her door. The search for the chief's missing son was about to begin. Dawn came pale and reluctant, as if the sun itself was afraid to witness what the storm had left behind. Clara had not slept. She'd spent the night in her rocking chair by the fire, the baby cradled against her chest, listening to each precious breath and praying it wouldn't be the last. The child had warmed slowly through the night, color returning to the tiny face, breathing growing stronger and more regular. But with the morning light came a revelation that made Clara's blood run cold. The baby wasn't just Comanche, he was important. As she gently changed the child's clothes, Clara discovered things that no ordinary baby would possess. A small silver medallion hung from a cord around his neck. Not the crude jewelry of a common tribal member, but something intricate, valuable. The kind of ornament reserved for chiefs' families. The moccasins, too, were extraordinary. Hand-sewn with tiny beads arranged in patterns Clara recognized from her late husband's trading days. Sacred symbols, protective totems, the footwear of someone born to leadership. But it was the scar that told the real story. A thin line across the baby's left shoulder, healed but recent. A mark that looked suspiciously like it had been made by a blade. This child hadn't just wandered away from his people. He'd been taken, and someone had tried to hurt him. Clara's hands stilled as the implications washed over her. She wasn't just harboring any Comanche baby. She was hiding someone's son. Someone important enough that people would kill for him. Someone important enough that his people would move heaven and earth to find him. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "Who are you, little one?" she whispered, tracing the tiny features with one finger. "And what happened to you out there?" The baby gurgled softly and grasped her finger with surprising strength. For a moment, Clara could have sworn she saw something ancient and knowing in those dark eyes, as if this child carried memories that predated his short life. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Clara's heart stopped. Nobody visited during blizzards. Nobody traveled in weather like this unless they had urgent business, or unless they were looking for something. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Moving quickly, Clara wrapped the baby in her heaviest quilt and placed him in the wooden crate that had once served as a cradle for her own children. She covered him completely, arranging firewood around the crate to disguise its contents. "Stay quiet, sweetheart," she whispered. "Please." She opened the door to find Eustace Carter, her nearest neighbor, standing on her porch with snow still clinging to his beard. His eyes were sharp with suspicion, and his hand rested casually on the pistol at his hip. "Morning, Clara," he said, pushing past her into the warmth of the cabin. "Hell of a storm." "That it was," Clara replied carefully, leaving the door open to show she had nothing to hide. "What brings you out in this weather, Eustace?" His gaze swept the room, lingering on the makeshift cradle before moving on. "Heard some strange sounds during the storm. Crying, maybe. Thought you might be in trouble." Clara's mouth went dry. If Eustace had heard the baby crying, others might have too. "Just the wind," she said with forced lightness. "You know how it sounds around these old buildings?" Eustace nodded slowly, but his eyes never stopped moving. "Funny thing, though. Johnson's boy found some tracks this morning, leading right up to your property line. Fresh tracks made during the storm." "Animal tracks, most likely," Clara said. "Deer get confused in weather like that." "Maybe." Eustace's smile was cold. "But these tracks looked mighty strange for deer, almost like someone was carrying something heavy." The baby chose that moment to whimper, the sound barely audible, but definitely human. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as Eustace's head snapped toward the sound. "What was that?" he asked. "What was what?" Clara replied, praying her voice sounded casual. Eustace took a step toward the woodpile where the baby lay hidden. "Sounded like—" The baby cried out again, louder this time, and Clara knew the game was up. There was no explaining away that sound, no pretending it was wind or settling timber. But before Eustace could investigate further, another sound cut through the morning air. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. Both Clara and Eustace froze as the sound grew closer. Through the open door, they could see riders cresting the ridge that bordered Clara's property. Not white men. The riding style was wrong. The posture different. Native riders. A lot of them. "Jesus Christ," Eustace breathed, his hand moving to his gun. "Clara, get back. We've got trouble." But Clara wasn't looking at the approaching riders with fear. She was looking at them with recognition. Because something deep in her bones, something that connected her to the child hidden in the woodpile, told her these weren't raiders or war parties. These were fathers looking for their sons. The lead rider was magnificent, tall and proud, wearing traditional Comanche regalia despite the cold. His horse, a painted stallion, moved with the fluid grace of an animal bred for warfare. But it was the rider's face that caught Clara's attention. The same dark eyes as the baby, the same proud cheekbones, the same sense of ancient wisdom. This wasn't just any Comanche warrior. This was the child's father, and he was coming to take his son home. The question was, would he see Clara as the woman who saved his child's life, or as the white settler who had stolen his son? Eustace raised his rifle, but Clara put a gentle hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "Let's see what they want." "Are you crazy?" Eustace hissed. "They're Comanche, Clara. They'll kill us both and burn the place down." But Clara was already moving toward the woodpile, toward the hidden baby who had stopped crying, as if he too sensed the approaching riders, as if he knew his people were coming. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is the right thing, and sometimes saving a life means risking your own. The riders were close now, close enough that Clara could see the determination in their faces, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they would find what they were looking for. Clara lifted the baby from his hiding place, holding him close as she walked toward the door. Eustace's protests fell on deaf ears. Outside, the Comanche war party had stopped 50 yards from the cabin. 30 riders, all armed, all watching the doorway with the intensity of predators. But they weren't attacking. They were waiting, waiting to see if the white woman in the doorway was friend or enemy, waiting to see if their long search was finally over. Clara stepped onto the porch, the baby visible in her arms, and felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. What happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her fate, but the fate of every soul in this valley. The lead rider, the father, dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He walked forward until he was close enough for conversation, close enough for Clara to see the pain and hope warring in his dark eyes. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You have my son." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the authority of a man who had never been wrong about the things that mattered most. Clara looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at the warrior who stood waiting for her answer. Behind him, 30 riders sat motionless, but Clara could feel their tension like electricity in the air. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." The admission hung between them like a bridge, one that could lead to peace or to violence, depending on the next words spoken. The warrior's eyes never left his son's face. "Will you give him back?" Clara's arms tightened around the baby, not in defiance, but in the instinctive protectiveness of someone who had already given too much love to let go easily. The child had become hers in the space of a single night, filling a hole in her heart that had been empty for 5 years. But as she looked at the desperate father, at the riders who had braved impossible weather to find their lost prince, she knew there was only one answer she could give. The question was whether giving the right answer would cost her everything. Time stopped. Clara stood on her porch, a Comanche baby in her arms, and 30 mounted warriors watching her every breath. Behind her, Eustace muttered prayers and curses in equal measure, his rifle trained on riders who could kill them both before he could fire a second shot. The baby's father stood perfectly still, waiting for her answer with the patience of a man who understood that some moments could not be rushed. His painted horse stamped once in the snow, but otherwise the world held its breath. Clara looked down at the child who had found her in the storm. In the morning light, the baby's resemblance to his father was unmistakable. The same proud profile, the same intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see too much. But where the warrior's face was marked by years of struggle and loss, the baby's held only trust. Trust in her, in the woman who had pulled him from the snow and kept him warm through the longest night of winter. "His name," Clara said quietly, surprising herself by speaking. "What's his name?" The warrior's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "In your tongue, it means brave walker. But he is too young yet for his true name. That will come when he proves himself." Clara nodded, understanding more than the warrior probably expected. She had grown up on the frontier, had learned enough about native customs to know that names were earned, not given, that this child carried the hopes of his entire people. "How was he lost?" she asked. The warrior's jaw tightened. "Taken, by men who thought to trade his life for gold. We tracked them for 7 days through storm and snow. When we found their camp, he paused, his hand moving unconsciously to the knife at his belt. There was no one left alive to question, only tracks leading away, tracks that ended in the storm. Clara's blood chilled as the implications became clear. Someone had kidnapped this child, a chief's son, by the look of the regalia, and tried to sell him. The thought of anyone treating a baby as cargo made her sick. "The men who took him," she said, "they're dead?" "Yes." The warrior's voice carried the finality of justice served. "But my son was not with them. We thought—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "We thought he had died in the storm." Clara felt the baby stir in her arms, making soft sounds as if he recognized his father's voice. The warrior's eyes fixed on his son with an intensity that spoke of nights without sleep, of prayers offered to spirits both ancient and desperate. "He nearly did die," Clara said softly. "I found him half buried in the snow, barely breathing. He's been warming by my fire all night." Something shifted in the warrior's posture. Not relaxation exactly, but a subtle easing of the tension that had held him rigid. For the first time since dismounting, he looked directly at Clara instead of his son. "You saved his life," he said. It wasn't a question. Any mother would have done the same. The words slipped out before Clara could stop them, and she saw the warrior's eyes narrow as he processed what she'd revealed, that she was a mother, that she understood the desperation that had driven him across miles of hostile territory in the worst storm anyone could remember. Behind the warrior, one of the other riders said something in rapid Comanche. Clara caught only fragments, words that might have meant white woman and enemy, and something else that sounded like a warning. The warrior, the chief, Clara realized, noting the deference the others showed him, raised one hand without turning around. The muttering stopped immediately. "What is your name?" he asked Clara. "Clara Whitmore." He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away for future use. "I am Chief Running Bear of the Quahati Comanche. This is my son, and heir to my people." The formal introduction sent a chill down Clara's spine. She wasn't just holding any baby, she was holding the future leader of one of the most feared warrior bands on the frontier. The child in her arms would someday command hundreds of warriors, would make decisions that affected the lives of thousands. And right now he was making soft, gurgling sounds and trying to grab her finger with tiny hands. "Chief Running Bear," Clara said carefully, "your son is safe, but he's also weak from the cold. He needs warmth and food and rest before he's strong enough to travel." "Then you will give him these things," the chief replied. "We will wait." Clara blinked. "You'll wait? Here, until he is strong." The implications hit her like a physical blow. A Comanche war party camped on her property, visible to every neighbor within miles. Word would spread within hours. By tomorrow, half the territory would know that Clara Whitmore was harboring Indians. In a region where Indian raids were a constant threat, where families had been killed and homesteads burned, harboring Comanche warriors was tantamount to treason. She'd be lucky if they only ran her out of town. More likely she'd end up dancing from the end of a rope. But as she looked at the baby in her arms, at the hope and desperation in his father's eyes, Clara realized she didn't care. "There's a place," she said slowly, "a valley about 2 miles north, sheltered from the wind. There's water there, and some protection from the weather. Your men could camp there without being seen from the main trail." Chief Running Bear studied her for a long moment. "And you? What do you gain from helping us?" Clara looked down at the baby, at the tiny face that had already burrowed its way into her heart. The child's eyes were open, studying her with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "I lost 3 babies," she said quietly, "to fever, to winter, to the hardness of this land. I couldn't save them, but maybe I can save him." The admission hung in the cold air between them, more vulnerable than Clara had intended. She'd never spoken of her losses to anyone, not even the neighbors who'd helped bury her children. But something about this moment, about the desperation she recognized in the chief's eyes, made the truth spill out. Chief Running Bear was silent for so long that Clara began to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. But then he spoke, his voice gentler than before. "The spirits work in strange ways," he said. "Perhaps they brought my son to someone who would understand his value." Behind him, the other warriors exchanged glances. Clara caught fragments of conversation, words that sounded like debate, like questions about trusting white settlers. But the chief's authority was absolute. When he finally turned back to his men and spoke in rapid Comanche, there was no further argument. The war party began moving toward the valley Clara had suggested, but 5 riders remained behind. The chief's personal guard, Clara realized. They would stay close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. Chief Running Bear turned back to Clara. 3 days, he said. In 3 days, my son will be strong enough to travel. Until then, we accept your hospitality. And if someone comes looking, if my neighbors see the smoke from your fires, the chief's smile was cold as winter wind. Then they will learn that some things are worth fighting for. Clara felt Eustace shift behind her, heard his sharp intake of breath. The implication was clear. The Comanche would protect their camp and their hosts with deadly force if necessary. One more thing, the chief said as he prepared to mount his horse. My son will need a name while he is in your care. Something you can call him. Clara looked down at the baby, at the dark eyes that seemed to hold such wisdom. A name came to her immediately, though she couldn't say why. Thomas, she said. I'll call him Thomas. Chief Running Bear paused with one foot in the stirrup. Why that name? It means twin, Clara said softly, and I have a feeling he's going to be part of 2 worlds before this is over. The chief mounted his horse and looked down at her one final time. In 3 days, Clara Whitmore, you will have a choice to make. When that time comes, remember that some debts can never be repaid, but some bonds last forever. He wheeled his horse around and rode toward the hidden valley, leaving Clara standing in the snow with a Comanche prince in her arms, and the certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Behind her, Eustace lowered his rifle with shaking hands. Clara, he said quietly, do you have any idea what you've just done? Clara looked down at baby Thomas, at the tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb, at the trust in those ancient eyes. Yes, she said, I think I do. But she was wrong, because in 3 days she would discover that saving a child's life was only the beginning of the story, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go. Word spread through the valley like wildfire despite the snow. By noon, Clara could see smoke rising from the direction of the Johnson farm, signal fires that meant neighbors were gathering, sharing information, preparing for trouble. By evening, she spotted riders on the distant ridges, silhouettes against the gray sky that washed her cabin with the patience of buzzards. They knew. Somehow they knew she was harboring Comanche. Clara sat by her fire, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms, and tried not to think about what the morning might bring. Outside, the 5 Comanche guards that Chief Running Bear had left behind moved like ghosts through the trees around her property. She caught glimpses of them occasionally, a flash of movement in the pines, the brief silhouette of a mounted warrior against the snow. But they remained invisible to casual observation. Still, secrets had a way of bleeding out in small communities. And in Montana territory, harboring Indians was a hanging offense. The first knock came just after sunset. Clara had been expecting it, but her heart still jumped as she heard the heavy boots on her porch. She wrapped Thomas more securely in his blankets and moved to the door, checking first to make sure the baby couldn't be seen from the entrance. Sheriff William Morrison stood outside, hat in hand but gun on hip, flanked by 2 deputies Clara recognized from town. Behind them, she could see at least a dozen more men on horseback, rifles across their saddles and expressions hard as granite. Evening, Clara, Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. Hear you've had some excitement out here. Just the storm, Sheriff, Clara replied, not inviting them in. Same as everyone else. Morrison's eyes swept past her into the cabin, noting the warm glow of the fire, the extra blankets scattered around the main room. Mind if we come in? It's cold as a witch's heart out here. Clara stepped aside reluctantly. The sheriff and his deputies entered, boots tracking snow across her clean floors, eyes sharp and searching. One of the deputies, a young man named Burke, whose sister had died in a Comanche raid the previous summer, kept his hand near his gun. Coffee? Clara offered, playing the gracious hostess while her heart hammered against her ribs. Don't mind if I do, Morrison said, settling into a chair near the fire. His gaze lingered on the cradle that still sat by the hearth, noting the blankets and the faint scent of baby powder that Clara hadn't been able to eliminate completely. As Clara poured coffee with hands that she willed to remain steady, Morrison continued his casual interrogation. "Funny thing," he said, "Eustace Carter came to town this afternoon with quite a story. Says he saw Indian tracks leading right up to your property. Says he heard unusual sounds coming from your cabin during the storm." Clara's hand paused for just a moment as she handed him the cup. "Eustace has been drinking more than usual lately," she said. "The isolation gets to some folks." "Maybe so," Morrison agreed. "But then we got reports of smoke from Devil's Valley. Indian smoke, according to Johnson's boy, who knows about such things. And Devil's Valley is mighty close to your property line." Behind Thomas stirred in his hiding place. A wooden chest Clara had fitted with blankets and positioned to look like a storage box. She'd cut small holes in the back for air, but if he started crying now, there would be no explaining it away. "Please," she thought desperately. "Please stay quiet, little one." Deputy Burke stood up suddenly, drawn to something near the fireplace. "Sheriff," he said, his voice tight with suspicion, "you need to see this." Clara's blood turned to ice as Burke bent down near the cradle, his fingers tracing something in the dust. When he stood up, he was holding a small bead, turquoise and silver, obviously Native American craftsmanship. "Well, well," Morrison said softly, examining the bead. "This is interesting, Clara. Mind explaining how Comanche beadwork ended up in your parlor?" Clara's mind raced, searching for an explanation that wouldn't sound like a lie. "I found it outside after the storm," she said. "Probably dropped by traders passing through." "In a blizzard?" Burke's voice was skeptical. "What trader would be fool enough to travel in weather like that?" Before Clara could answer, Thomas chose that moment to whimper, a soft, sleepy sound that could have been mistaken for a settling log or creaking timber. Could have been, if every man in the room hadn't been straining to hear exactly that sound. Morrison's head snapped toward the chest where the baby lay hidden. "What was that?" "What was what?" Clara asked, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. The sheriff was already moving, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. His hand reached for the lid of the chest, and Clara knew that in seconds her world would collapse around her. That's when the shooting started outside. The first gunshot cracked like thunder, followed immediately by shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats. Through the window, Clara could see muzzle flashes in the darkness. The men Morrison had left outside were firing at shadows that moved between the trees with supernatural grace. "Ambush!" Burke shouted, drawing his gun and rushing toward the door. Morrison hesitated, torn between investigating the chest and defending his men. The decision was made for him when a bullet shattered the window nearest the fireplace, sending glass across the room like deadly rain. "Get down!" the sheriff yelled, abandoning his search to take cover. But Clara was already moving, using the chaos to retrieve Thomas from his hiding place. The baby was awake now, eyes wide but mercifully quiet, as if he understood that silence meant survival. The battle outside raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Clara huddled in the corner with Thomas, listening to gunfire and war cries and the sound of horses wheeling and charging in the snow. The Comanche guards were severely outnumbered, but they fought with the skill of men defending their chief's son. Gradually, the sounds of battle moved away from the cabin, drawing the sheriff's men deeper into the trees. Clara realized with a mixture of relief and terror that the warriors were deliberately leading the posse away from her home, giving her time to escape with the baby. But escape to where? And how long before Morrison returned with reinforcements? As if summoned by her thoughts, a new sound reached her ears. A single horse approaching at a gallop. Clara peered through the shattered window and felt her heart leap. Chief Running Bear sat his painted stallion in her yard, magnificent and terrible in the moonlight. He'd come for his son. Clara bundled Thomas in the warmest blankets she could find and stepped out into the night. The chief dismounted and approached her, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats. "The fighting?" Clara asked. "My warriors will lead your lawmen in circles until dawn," he replied. "But they will return, and when they do, they will bring more men." Clara nodded, understanding. The secret was out now. By tomorrow, every newspaper in the territory would carry the story of the white woman who'd harbored a Comanche war chief's son. There would be no going back to her old life. "Your son is ready to travel," she said, offering the baby to his father. But Chief Running Bear didn't immediately take the child. Instead, he studied Clara's face in the moonlight, seeing something there that made him pause. "You cannot stay here," he said quietly. "When the sun rises, they will come with enough men to burn this valley to ash." Clara had already reached the same conclusion. The moment Morrison returned to town with his story, every able-bodied man in 3 counties would ride out to capture or kill the Comanche war party. And Clara would be branded a traitor, a collaborator, a woman who had chosen Indians over her own kind. "I know," she said simply. The chief continued to study her, and Clara had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through to her soul. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Then you will come with us." Clara's breath caught. "What?" "My son has bonded with you. He knows your scent, your voice, your touch. To take him from you now would be cruel." The chief's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "And you have proven yourself worthy of trust. Come north with us, to our winter camp, at least until the spring, when passions have cooled and it is safe for you to return." The offer hung in the cold air between them like a lifeline. Clara looked around at her cabin, at the life she'd built from nothing after her husband's death, at the graves of her children beneath the pine trees. Everything she'd ever known was here, but everything she'd ever loved was gone. "If I come," she said slowly, "what happens to me? I'm not Comanche. I don't know your ways." "You will learn," the chief replied, "and you will be protected. My word on this." Thomas stirred in Clara's arms, making soft sounds that seemed to echo his father's invitation. The baby's tiny hand found Clara's finger and gripped it with surprising strength, as if he too was asking her to stay. "The sheriff will think I was kidnapped," Clara said, working through the implications. "He'll organize rescue parties." "Let him try," the chief said with cold confidence. "By the time the snows melt, you will have made your choice. Return to your old life or begin a new one. But tonight you must choose quickly. My warriors cannot hold off the white men forever." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley. The battle was moving closer again, which meant Morrison's men were either winning or regrouping for another assault. Clara looked down at Thomas, at the tiny face that had already become so precious to her. In 3 days, this child had given her something she'd thought was lost forever: purpose, the chance to be a mother again, even if only temporarily. "My husband's grave," she said quietly. "My children's graves. I can't just leave them." Chief Running Bear's expression softened with understanding. "The dead do not live in the ground," he said. "They live in the hearts of those who remember them. You will carry your family with you wherever you go." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, the first tears she'd shed since finding Thomas in the snow. The chief was right, of course. Her husband and children weren't buried in the pine grove behind her cabin. They lived in her memories, in the love that would never die. "What about my things? My belongings?" "Take what you can carry, leave the rest. Things can be replaced. Lives cannot." The wisdom in his words struck her like a physical blow. How many times had she sat alone in her cabin, surrounded by the possessions of the dead, thinking that keeping their things meant keeping them alive? But things were just things. Love was what mattered, and love could survive anywhere. "All right," Clara heard herself say. "I'll come." The chief nodded as if he'd never doubted her answer. "Quickly then, take only what you need." Clara rushed back into the cabin, her mind racing as she tried to decide what parts of her old life were worth saving. In the end, she took very little: some clothes, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her wedding day, and the small wooden toys she'd carved for her children. Everything else could burn. She was stuffing the last items into a traveling bag when she heard Thomas crying. Not the weak whimpers of a sick child, but the strong, healthy cries of a baby who was warm and safe and very much alive. The sound filled her heart with fierce joy. This was why she was leaving, not to escape her old life, but to embrace a new one, to be the mother this child needed, even if it meant walking away from everything familiar. When she emerged from the cabin, She found Chief Running Bear mounted and waiting, with Thomas secured in a traditional cradle board on his back. The baby looked perfectly content, as if being carried by his father was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you ready?" the chief asked. Clara took one last look at her cabin, at the life she was leaving behind. Then she mounted the horse the chief had brought for her, a gentle mare with kind eyes, and nodded. "I'm ready." They rode north into the darkness, toward the hidden valley where the rest of the war party waited. Behind them, Clara's cabin sat empty and silent, already beginning to feel like a memory. But as they crested the ridge that would take them beyond the reach of Morrison's men, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Hope. Thomas was crying again, but it wasn't the desperate wailing of a child in distress. It was the strong, demanding cry of a baby who expected his needs to be met, who knew he was loved and protected. For the first time since her own children had died, Clara was going home. The Comanche winter camp was unlike anything Clara had ever imagined. Hidden in a valley so remote it didn't appear on any white man's map, protected by natural stone walls and heated by hot springs that kept the worst of winter at bay, the settlement was a masterpiece of survival and adaptation. Dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns, each family's dwelling positioned according to ancient customs and practical needs. But it was the children that took Clara's breath away. They were everywhere, laughing, playing, learning the skills they would need to survive in a world that grew more dangerous each year. Boys practicing with miniature bows, girls helping their mothers with beadwork and cooking, toddlers tumbling in the snow like bear cubs. So many children, so much life. Clara had expected to feel like an outsider, a white woman thrust into an alien world. Instead, as she dismounted in the center of the camp with Thomas in her arms, she felt something unexpected. She felt welcome. Word of her arrival had preceded them. The warriors who had fought Morrison's men had returned with stories of the white woman who had risked everything to save their future chief. As Clara walked through the camp, following Chief Running Bear toward his family's lodge, she saw curiosity in the faces that watched her, but no hostility. Children peered at her from behind their mother's skirts, fascinated by her pale skin and light hair. Elderly women nodded respectfully as she passed, their eyes soft with understanding. These were people who knew what it meant to protect children, to make sacrifices for the sake of the young. Chief Running Bear's lodge was larger than the others, befitting his status, but it was the woman who emerged to greet them that commanded Clara's attention. She was beautiful in the way that carved ivory is beautiful. Smooth, pale, elegant. But there was steel beneath the beauty, strength in the way she carried herself, and wisdom in her dark eyes. This was a woman who had seen hardship and emerged unbroken. "My wife," Chief Running Bear said simply. "Singing Bird." The woman approached Clara with measured steps, her gaze moving from Clara's face to the baby in her arms. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear. "You are the one who saved my son." It wasn't a question, and Clara sensed that her answer would determine everything that followed. "Yes," she said simply. Singing Bird studied her for a long moment, then reached out and gently touched Thomas's cheek. The baby gurgled and reached for his mother, and Clara felt a pang of loss as she realized this was the beginning of the end of their bond. But instead of taking Thomas immediately, Singing Bird surprised Clara by stepping back. "He has grown attached to you," she observed. "He knows your scent, your voice. To separate you now would cause him distress." Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. I understand if you want to take him. He's your son." "Yes," Singing Bird agreed. "He is my son, but for 3 days you have been his mother. That bond cannot be broken with a single decision." Chief Running Bear nodded approvingly at his wife's words. "Singing Bird will teach you our ways," he said to Clara. "You will stay in our lodge until spring, helping to care for Thomas and learning what it means to be Comanche." "But I'm not Comanche," Clara protested. "I'm white. I don't belong here." Singing Bird's smile was gentle but firm. "You saved our child's life. That makes you family, and family always belongs." Over the following days, Clara discovered that Singing Bird's words were more than mere politeness. The Comanche had a concept of kinship that went far beyond blood. a belief that certain bonds were chosen by the spirits themselves and could not be severed by human will. Clara had been chosen to save Thomas. Therefore, she had been chosen to be part of his family. The learning curve was steep. Clara had to master everything from the proper way to prepare buffalo meat to the intricate protocols that governed daily life in the camp. She learned to speak basic Comanche, to recognize the subtle signals that indicated mood or intent, to read the weather signs that meant the difference between survival and death on the plains. But it was her relationship with Thomas that provided the greatest challenges and the deepest rewards. The baby had indeed bonded with her during those crucial first days. He slept better when she held him, ate more readily when she fed him, and cried inconsolably when she was out of sight for too long. Singing Bird, rather than being jealous of this attachment, seemed to find it amusing. "He has chosen you as his second mother," she explained one evening as they sat by the fire, Thomas sleeping peacefully between them. "This is not uncommon among our people. Children often choose the adults who will guide them, regardless of blood." "But what happens when I leave?" Clara asked. "When spring comes and it's safe for me to return to my own people?" Singing Bird was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working steadily on a piece of beadwork. "That is a choice you must make when the time comes," she said finally. "But remember, choice works both ways. Perhaps when spring arrives, you will discover that your own people are no longer your people." The words proved prophetic sooner than Clara expected. 2 weeks after her arrival in the winter camp, a messenger arrived with news that made her blood run cold. The territorial governor had issued a warrant for her arrest, charging her with treason and conspiracy against the United States. A reward of $500 had been offered for information leading to her capture. But worse than the legal troubles was the personal betrayal. Her neighbors, people she had known for years, who had attended her husband's funeral and helped her through the darkest days of her grief, had signed a petition declaring her an enemy of white civilization. They had seized her property under territorial law, claiming she had forfeited her rights when she chose to aid the enemy. "They have taken everything," Clara whispered when Chief Running Bear finished translating the message. "My home, my land, my reputation, everything." "Not everything," Singing Bird said quietly. She was holding Thomas, who had learned to recognize Clara's voice, and was reaching for her with chubby arms. "They cannot take love. They cannot take the choice you made to save a life." Clara took the baby, feeling the familiar warmth of his small body against her chest. In the weeks since arriving at the camp, Thomas had grown stronger, healthier, more alert. He smiled now when he saw her, babbled constantly, and had even begun trying to pull himself upright. She had helped save his life, but in doing so, he had saved hers. "What am I now?" Clara asked, the question torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "If I'm not welcome among the whites and I'm not truly Comanche, what am I?" Chief Running Bear looked up from the message he'd been studying. "You are what you choose to be," he said simply. "The whites may have cast you out, but that only means you are free to become something new." That night, Clara lay awake in the warm lodge, listening to the sounds of the sleeping camp and thinking about identity, belonging, and the strange paths that led people to their true homes. She had come to this place as a refugee, fleeing the consequences of a single act of mercy. But somewhere along the way, she had begun to think of it differently. She wasn't a white woman hiding among Indians. She was a mother protecting her child. Because that's what Thomas had become to her. Not a Comanche baby she was helping to raise, but her child in every way that mattered. She knew the sound of his breathing, the meaning of his different cries, the way his face lit up when he saw her in the morning. And he knew her. Not as the white woman who had saved him, but as the person who loved him unconditionally. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a peace she hadn't felt since her own children had died. Spring was still months away. When it came, she would have to make a choice: return to a world that no longer wanted her, or stay in one that had embraced her as family. But as Thomas stirred in his sleep and reached for her with tiny hands, Clara realized she had already made her choice. She was exactly where she belonged. Spring came early to the hidden valley, arriving on wings of warm wind that melted the last of winter's ice and filled the air with the scent of growing things. Clara had been with the Comanche for 4 months now, long enough to understand their rhythms, their customs, their deep connection to the land that sustained them. Long enough to know she never wanted to leave. Thomas was walking now, taking wobbly steps between Clara and Singing Bird, while both women cheered his progress. At 10 months old, he was bright, curious, and utterly fearless, a combination that kept both his mothers constantly vigilant. Because that's what Clara had become, officially and without ceremony. Singing Bird had started referring to her as Thomas's second mother in front of the entire tribe, and gradually, naturally, the title had stuck. Children called her Mother Clara, warriors nodded to her with the respect due to a chief's family member, and elders sought her opinion on matters relating to the raising of children. She belonged here in ways she had never belonged anywhere else. But belonging, Clara was learning, sometimes came with a price. The message arrived on a warm morning in March, carried by a scout who had ridden hard from the eastern boundaries of Comanche territory. Clara was helping Singing Bird prepare the morning meal when Chief Running Bear burst into the lodge, his face grim with news that could only be bad. "They are coming," he said without preamble. 500 soldiers, led by Colonel Marcus Webb. They march under orders to retrieve the white woman and punish the savages who corrupted her. Clara's hands stilled on the corn she'd been grinding. 500 soldiers, the entire territorial garrison, plus militia and volunteers. They weren't coming to negotiate or to make peace. They were coming to destroy the winter camp and everyone in it. "How long do we have?" Singing Bird asked, her voice calm despite the catastrophe bearing down on them. 3 days, perhaps 4, if the muddy roads slow them down." The chief's eyes met Clara's across the fire. "They believe you are here against your will, a captive to be rescued rather than a guest to be respected." Clara felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. "And if they find me here willingly? If they discover I chose to stay? Then they will declare you legally dead and hang your body anyway," Chief Running Bear replied bluntly. In their minds, the Clara Whitmore who saved a Comanche child ceased to exist the moment she disappeared. What remains is either a victim to be pitied or a traitor to be punished. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Clara. She had found more acceptance, more genuine love, more sense of family among the Comanche than she had ever known among her own people. But the world would never see it that way. "We could fight," Singing Bird said quietly. "The valley has good defensive positions. We could make them pay dearly for what they want. And watch our children die in the crossfire?" Chief Running Bear shook his head. "Number we run, tonight under cover of darkness. By the time the soldiers arrive, we will be gone." Clara listened to them discuss escape routes and rally points, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Thomas, who was currently napping peacefully in his cradle, unaware that his world was about to be torn apart again. She was thinking about the choice that had brought her here, and the choice she would have to make now. Because there was a third option that nobody had mentioned yet. "What if I went back?" Clara said suddenly, interrupting the tactical planning. "What if I surrendered myself to the soldiers before they reached the valley?" Both Chief Running Bear and Singing Bird stared at her, as if she'd suggested setting herself on fire. "They would arrest you," Singing Bird protested. "Put you on trial for treason. You could hang." "Maybe," Clara agreed, "but it would also end the pursuit. If they have their white captive back, they won't need to chase down the war party that supposedly kidnapped her. The tribe would be safe." "Absolutely not," Chief Running Bear said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. "You are family now. We do not sacrifice family to save ourselves." Clara felt her heart swell with love for these people who had adopted her so completely. But she also felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Thomas," she said quietly. "What happens to Thomas if we run? He'll spend his childhood fleeing from soldiers, hiding in remote valleys, never knowing safety or peace. Is that the life you want for your son?" The chief's jaw tightened. Better than the life he would have with no parents at all. "But what if there was another way? What if—" Clara paused, the idea forming even as she spoke it. "What if I could buy you time? Years of time, enough for Thomas to grow up strong and wise and ready to lead his people?" "How?" Singing Bird asked. though Clara could see in her eyes that she already suspected the answer. By giving the soldiers what they want, Clara said simply, a story they can believe. A white woman grateful to be rescued from savage captivity, ready to return to civilization and never speak of her time among the Indians. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Clara could see the chief working through the logic, understanding the bitter wisdom of her plan, even as his heart rebelled against it. You would lie to them, he said finally. Pretend that everything they believe is true. I would protect my family, Clara corrected. And Thomas is my family now, just as much as he is yours. Singing Bird had been silent throughout the exchange, but now she spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who had learned to see truth clearly. If you do this thing, she said to Clara, you can never return, never see Thomas again, never know what kind of man he becomes. The sacrifice would be complete. Clara nodded, feeling tears start to burn her eyes. I know, and we would have to let you go. Even though every instinct tells us to protect you, we would have to watch you walk away. I know, Clara whispered. Thomas chose that moment to wake up, making the soft, gurgling sounds that meant he was hungry. Clara went to him automatically, lifting him from his cradle and settling him against her chest. He looked up at her with the complete trust that only children possess, his tiny hand grasping her finger with surprising strength. This was what love looked like, Clara realized, not the romantic passion of her marriage, or even the fierce protectiveness she'd felt for her own biological children. This was love stripped down to its essence, the willingness to sacrifice everything for another person's well-being. There's something else, Chief Running Bear said quietly. If you return to the white world, they will want proof that you were truly a captive. They will ask questions, demand details, and they will want to know about Thomas. Clara's blood chilled as she understood the implication. They'll want him back. They'll claim he was kidnapped too. Yes, and unlike you, he cannot lie about his treatment here, cannot pretend to be grateful for rescue from people who love him. The full scope of the dilemma hit Clara like a physical blow. It wasn't enough for her to sacrifice herself. She would also have to convince the authorities that Thomas was dead, lost in the wilderness, where he could never be found. She would have to let the world believe she had failed to save him. I can do it, she said, though the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. I can make them believe he died in the storm, that I tried to save him but couldn't. They'll see it as proof that I was a victim, not a collaborator. Clara, Singing Bird said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. Are you certain? Once this path is chosen, it cannot be unchanged. Clara looked down at Thomas, memorizing every detail of his face. The dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, the tiny nose that would someday grow proud and strong like his father's, the soft hair that felt like silk beneath her fingers. Tell me his real name, she said suddenly, his Comanche name, the one he'll carry when he becomes a man. Chief Running Bear hesitated, then spoke a series of syllables that flowed like water over stone. In your language, it means bridge walker, one who travels between worlds and brings them together. Maybe, Clara agreed, but it would also end the pursuit. If they have their white captive back, they won't need to chase down the war party that supposedly kidnapped her. The tribe would be safe. Absolutely not, Chief Running Bear said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. You are family now. We do not sacrifice family to save ourselves. Clara felt her heart swell with love for these people who had adopted her so completely. But she also felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Thomas, she said quietly. What happens to Thomas if we run? He'll spend his childhood fleeing from soldiers, hiding in remote valleys, never knowing safety or peace. Is that the life you want for your son? The chief's jaw tightened. Better than the life he would have with no parents at all. But what if there was another way? What if... Clara paused, the idea forming even as she spoke it. What if I could buy you time? Years of time, enough for Thomas to grow up strong and wise and ready to lead his people? How? Singing Bird asked, though Clara could see in her eyes that she already suspected the answer. By giving the soldiers what they want, Clara said simply, a story they can believe. A white woman grateful to be rescued from savage captivity, ready to return to civilization and never speak of her time among the Indians. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Clara could see the chief working through the logic, understanding the bitter wisdom of her plan, even as his heart rebelled against it. "You would lie to them," he said finally. "Pretend that everything they believe is true." "I would protect my family," Clara corrected. "And Thomas is my family now, just as much as he is yours." Singing Bird had been silent throughout the exchange, but now she spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who had learned to see truth clearly. "If you do this thing," she said to Clara, "you can never return, never see Thomas again, never know what kind of man he becomes. The sacrifice would be complete." Clara nodded, feeling tears start to burn her eyes. "I know, and we would have to let you go. Even though every instinct tells us to protect you, we would have to watch you walk away." "I know," Clara whispered. Thomas chose that moment to wake up, making the soft, gurgling sounds that meant he was hungry. Clara went to him automatically, lifting him from his cradle and settling him against her chest. He looked up at her with the complete trust that only children possess, his tiny hand grasping her finger with surprising strength. This was what love looked like, Clara realized. Not the romantic passion of her marriage, or even the fierce protectiveness she'd felt for her own biological children. This was love stripped down to its essence, the willingness to sacrifice everything for another person's well-being. "There's something else," Chief Running Bear said quietly. "If you return to the white world, they will want proof that you were truly a captive. They will ask questions, demand details, and they will want to know about Thomas." Clara's blood chilled as she understood the implication. "They'll want him back. They'll claim he was kidnapped too. Yes, and unlike you, he cannot lie about his treatment here, cannot pretend to be grateful for rescue from people who love him." The full scope of the dilemma hit Clara like a physical blow. It wasn't enough for her to sacrifice herself. She would also have to convince the authorities that Thomas was dead, lost in the wilderness, where he could never be found. She would have to let the world believe she had failed to save him. "I can do it," she said, though the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "I can make them believe he died in the storm, that I tried to save him but couldn't. They'll see it as proof that I was a victim, not a collaborator." "Clara," Singing Bird said softly, reaching out to touch her hand, "are you certain? Once this path is chosen, it cannot be unchanged." Clara looked down at Thomas, memorizing every detail of his face. The dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, the tiny nose that would someday grow proud and strong like his father's, the soft hair that felt like silk beneath her fingers. "Tell me his real name," she said suddenly, "his Comanche name, the one he'll carry when he becomes a man." Chief Running Bear hesitated, then spoke a series of syllables that flowed like water over stone. "In your language, it means bridge walker, one who travels between worlds and brings them together." Bridge walker. The name fit perfectly. A child who had already brought together a white woman and a Comanche family, who had shown Clara that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that humans drew around themselves. "Perfect," Clara whispered, pressing a kiss to Thomas's forehead. "When he's old enough to understand, tell him that his second mother loved him enough to disappear." That night, as the camp prepared for evacuation, Clara made her own preparations. She would leave before dawn, walking east toward the advancing soldiers with a story of escape and survival that would protect the people she loved. But first, she had one last gift to give. Working by firelight, Clara carefully carved a small wooden bird, a dove, symbol of peace, and hung it from a leather cord. On the back, she carved 3 letters, CW, her initials but also a promise. "Clara watches." She placed the pendant around Thomas's neck, whispering words she hoped he would somehow remember when he was grown. "Your second mother will always be watching over you," she said. "No matter how far apart we are, no matter how many years pass, you will always be loved." Thomas gurgled and reached for the pendant, fascinated by the way it caught the firelight. He had no idea that this was goodbye, but Clara knew. And as she held him one last time, memorizing the weight of him in her arms and the sweet baby scent of his hair, she made a promise that would sustain her through all the lonely years to come. Someday when he was a man, Bridge Walker would know that he had been loved, that a white woman had chosen to disappear rather than let him be taken from his family. That love, real love, sometimes meant letting go. Dawn came too soon, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Clara kissed Thomas goodbye while he slept, whispered a prayer to whatever spirits watched over children and mothers who loved them, and walked out of the lodge into the growing light. Behind her, the Comanche camp was already stirring, preparing for the exodus that would take them far from the reach of white soldiers. Ahead of her, somewhere beyond the horizon, 500 men marched with orders to rescue a woman who didn't want to be saved. But between those two worlds, in the space of a single footstep, Clara Whitmore made the choice that would define the rest of her life. She chose love, and sometimes love means walking away. Clara Whitmore's story didn't end with her surrender to Colonel Webb's soldiers. The official records show that she was found wandering in a state of delirium after escaping from savage captivity. She told a story of struggle and survival that made her a hero in the white settlements. The brave woman who had tried to save an Indian baby, but had ultimately failed when the child succumbed to exposure. She never spoke of the warm lodge where she had been welcomed as family, or the woman who had shared her son's mothering, or the chief who had treated her with more respect than her own neighbors ever had. She carried those secrets to her grave, along with the image of a baby boy whose real name meant Bridgewalker. But secrets have a way of surviving the people who keep them. Years later, stories began to circulate among the Comanche about a great chief who bore the mark of a carved dove around his neck. A leader who spoke of the white woman who had saved his life, who taught his people that courage came in many forms. They say he kept a wooden bird until the day he died, and that sometimes when the wind was right, he would hold it to the sky and whisper words of gratitude to a mother who had loved him enough to let him go. What would you have done in Clara's position? Could you have walked away from a child you loved to save their life? And what do you think happened to Bridgewalker when he grew up? Did he remember the white woman who disappeared for his sake? This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of love is the hardest one to make. That family isn't always about blood, and that courage comes in forms we don't always recognize. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what it really means to be a parent, a protector, a bridge between different worlds, then we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Your words matter to us, and they matter to this community we're building together. And if you want more stories that challenge what you think you know about the Old West, stories that show the human heart in all its complexity and contradiction, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because every week, we're here with new tales of courage, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that love can change the world. Tomorrow we have another story waiting, one about a former slave who became a legendary lawman, and the day he had to choose between justice and mercy. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about right and wrong. Until then, remember, in the wild frontier of the human heart, the greatest adventures are the ones that teach us who we really are. This has been Wild West Stories. Thank you for riding with us.